But we're ready now to move to our Luncheon keynote presentation and to introduce our special guest, whom I mentioned earlier in our opening remarks about his innovative entrepreneurship, is Andrew Studiford. Andrew is the editor of Capital Matters at National Review, and we look forward to his conversation with Mr. Hamm. Andrew?
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. As always, another terrific Coolidge event. And it's also great. What I shall do is I shall just say a few words about the man who do the introduction about the man who needs no introduction. And then he and I will have a conversation. We've got a couple of questions in also from Coolidge scholars. And if you want to submit any more, please feel free and just find a Coolidge staffer at the back of the room. So to our next guest, Harold Hamm. He's the chairman and CEO of Cottonelle, his oil company. It's grand title, chairman, CEO, but it's not enough to describe someone who personifies the way in which free markets have contributed to the American flourishing and at times have come to its rescue. His book, Game Changer, which I thoroughly recommend, and I have been offered no oil wells to encourage me to make this recommendation, is a terrific read, and it is also, there are some technical bits about it, but Harold's genius is such that he can explain technical stuff to a fool like me, and I can more or less understand it. He has played an indispensable role in the renaissance of American energy via horizontal drilling to the shale revolution, and there's a route there. And that renaissance, taken too much for granted, in my view, and unfairly vilified, in my view, came under fire most notably in the Biden era. And Mr. Hamm has been one of the fiercest advocates of ensuring that its momentum picks up again, as it should do, and continue. One of the enjoyable parts of the book are comments about some of our political figures. Jimmy Carter got a lot of things wrong, I think we could say. Harold Hamm has not only revived American energy, but if I may say so, as someone with a rather unfortunate accent in this 250th anniversary year, he personifies to me what I've always thought of as a very American energy. He's the sort of reason that I came to this country. He's a risk taker. He's an entrepreneur. He's an optimist. Questionable, what was that? An original thinker, an innovator, and he is someone who is not afraid to give his point of view, as we may discover in the next 45 minutes. His is also a very American story. He began life as the youngest of 13 children, the son of a sharecropper, and in a wonderful irony, illustrative irony, this is a man who's done so much for the energy of this country, and yet electricity only reached the family home when he was 4 or 5. New Deal? What was that? They're a bit late. I'll just conclude with this. I'm not quite sure what it meant, but it wasn't good, I knew that. His first job in the oil industry seemed to involve oil sludge tanks. And yet here we are. So, Mr. Hamm, thank you very much for coming. To start with the beginning, many people in this room grew up after the shale revolution, which transformed this country's energy position and which owes so much to you. It's in a way old news, although its consequences are not, and it sometimes seems, as I said in the introduction, taken for granted. What do you think that younger Americans most misunderstand about fragile US energy security, how fragile it once was, or perceived to be, and why do you think that mattered so much?
Well, today, I never thought this possible, but today, energy is everything. I mean, you can't read anything unless it's about energy, because it runs the world. And so it's so very important. And then you have to look back, where all this began. And we were in what's known as terminal decline. Okay, the production was going down, and from a high, of close to 10, 11 million barrels a day in America in the 70s, had gone down to about 4.5 million barrels a day. And we were totally dependent on somebody else for all of our energy needs. And so from there, you had only one way to go, and that's up. But we had to move to something totally different. And so that brought in a whole different technology, something nobody thought was possible, and that's horizontal drilling. And that's what changed the world. And Chris Wright says it's best. It revolutionized energy in the world and lowered energy costs for every single person in the world. So that's how big it was.
Very big. Now, if we go back to before your revolution, you have argued that back then, much of the problem with the American oil industry, oil and gas industry, was, if you like, self-induced. Or when I say self-induced, I mean government-induced. Could you give some examples of that? I know you can.
Yes, I certainly can. We had everything that you think of wrong. We're all capitalists here, so let's think about that. Think about when Richard Nixon put oil under price controls when it went up 25 cents a barrel in 73. It went up 25 cents a barrel from $4 to $4.25, and he put it under price controls. Well, that's going to guarantee you're going to get no more, right? And that's what he did. And then we had all kind of controls on natural gas. Had guaranteeing cheap prices to the consumer. Well, that worked for a little bit, and then you ran out. And so that's what we were facing in America, was a real shortage of oil and gas. And there's all kind of regulatory controls on top of that. Controlled everything you did, and so for all the wrong reasons. And we needed none of that, so you had to change that. But then it took something even greater. It took something that could completely revolutionize it, and that's where horizontal drilling came in. Nobody thought it was possible. Does everybody understand horizontal drilling, what you do?
Please explain.
Let me explain it in ways that you can understand it. If you drill through that much where the pages are of a pay zone, and said it was so as thick as this ceiling, 8 to 10 foot thick, good pay zone, and a good source of supply. It's at 10,000 feet deep. But you drill through that and you vertically, and you're going to have a very limited pay zone, 10 foot thick that you could produce, and it would be gone. Okay, if you drill it horizontally, if you went down and intersected that pay zone and drill it for 12,500 feet, 2 miles, and put that on pay, what's a multiplier? Now, everybody can do the math on that, right? But it comes out to be close to millions when you look at the productivity, the multiplier. So if a well would make 200 barrels a day here, what would it make drilled horizontally? And so that's what really became into existence, and that's what we did. Okay, so a lot of things was going against that. You just can't think about it. You know, you're going to drill down with a drill pipe that's 5.5 inches around, that big, and you're going to turn that and go 90 degrees horizontally. Well, you can't do that, right? Well, that's what we did.
And there are also some good illustrations in the book for anyone who wants to see how it works. And just, in fact, I'll skip forward to something I was going to ask you. So here you are. You did something that people considered to be impossible. And do you think, you know, you were an outsider, if I could put it that way, you know, not from a privileged background. You made your own way. You took your education as you could get it. And do you think, and maybe this is, I hope this isn't too sort of Phil Donahue-like type question, but do you think it made it easier for you to think out of the box, the fact that you hadn't been in the box in the first place?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I didn't know what you couldn't do. So it made it easy. You know, I didn't know you couldn't do those things. And so we did it the hard way. We did it with drill bits and drilling rigs and mechanically made that happen and had people tell me I needed special tools. And I had I'll mention one name here, but I don't think it hurt him. The president of Halliburton needed near bit technology at that time where it would have helped a lot. But it brought in all four of the major services from America, Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker, all the big ones at the time, and Sperry Son from Canada. And I said, you know, I need this technology, and you know, I just couldn't understand them not jumping on it, you know, because I could see the potential. They couldn't. But anyway, the president of Halliburton told me, said, now you can't expect us to put a lot of research money into that. That is such a novel idea. And I said, well, let me spell it out for you in a business sense. Whoever does, we're going to give them 100% of our work. Oh, okay. But he still didn't do it. But Sperry Son did. And so we gave him 100% of the work. They figured it out. That made them a lot of money. 3 years later, Halliburton had to go buy them to get the technology. Capitalism, right?
It works.
It works.
So just to go, because I've got ahead of myself there, but the decision to go for horizontal drilling, and you know, you are an instinctive oil man. You're embedded in the law of the oil world. I never knew that. I think it was wildcatters used to be known as sniffers because they could sniff the oil out, was the theory. And you are a reservoir, so to speak, of stories about this. But it's a risky business, oil, drilling, with all the science, and you are very much a man of science. How do you feel about risk?
Well, it's you know, like every business person does, you consider risk, and most people try to avoid all the risk and do very well. But in our business, you know, you have to take risk. You just have to be willing to accept it and weigh it properly and be able to go on. So you talk about the wildcatters and sniffing, you know, I talk about it in the book, but, you know, some people get something in their brain. I did when I was in high school. That's why I like to talk to young people. And early on, I decided that I wanted to be an oil and gas explorationist, like so many of the great people from Oklahoma. J. Paul Getty and, Bill Skelly and, just goes on and on. I mean, there's so many great, there's no comma. And so that's what I wanted to do. And from there on, nothing changed. I set that course and I stayed with it. But I couldn't even go to college out of high school. I had to go to the oil patch. I had to find enough oil that I could go to college. I could become that geologist, somebody that would know the rock the way I do. And so it was double tough, starting from that condition. But once I did, then that led me to where I could find those oil fields you talked about. So anyway, I hope I answered your question.
You did. And then if there was one, I don't know, moment when you thought that the experts were all wrong, was it the moment that the past presidents were wrong? But Nixon as well, the oil controls. He should be mayor of New York, that man. He's got everything it takes. And was there one moment, when he said, this is the answer? Was it when you looked under the city of, so to speak, under the city of Enid in Oklahoma and saw all that oil there, which no one could touch because you can't really dig up a city to get at the oil?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it really did get us into horizontal drilling. And that was to drill under cities with highly deviated wells and intersect, those reserves that was under the cities that were still there and had been stranded, if you will, by the city growth. But what I saw was that these highly deviated wells going through those formations was producing 2-3 times what a vertical well would do. So wow, the light went on. So that was kind of a defining moment. And so then began looking for, what is the right place to apply this technology. And so that's what took me to North Dakota and Cedar Hills in particular. That was the first really field ever drilled strictly with horizontal wells. It would not produce drilled vertically in sufficient terms to pay the wells off. But drilled horizontally was a great play. And so that was, wasn't real big, made 250 million barrels recoverable. That's pretty big for me. But that's where it began.
Yes, and could you explain that? I mean, you've half answered my next question already. The leap between horizontal drilling and then applying it to shale. Why can't you? The ignorant question here. Why can't you just dig down the old vertical inefficient way?
No, that's a very good question, because Cedar Hills was not shale. It was in another formation that basically had natural porosity and permeability. Just the permeability wasn't connected. But with shales is totally different. So we go to the Bakken. So we drill the Cedar Hills and this thin bedded reservoir across there. We thought, wow, horizontal drilling can really turn those on. Where's the next one? And so that's when we found, we mapped. I had a geologist, a geologist in my office, mapped the Bakken. And he came back and said, I think this would produce drilled horizontally. And so we got to looking at it and got there. The shale is a completely different deal. The shales is the source bed themselves. That's where oil and gas is generated. It goes through the maturation process from the TOC that's in it, the organics, and that produce oil and gas. But it has no porosity, no permeability. So it's tough. It's all something that you have to use horizontal drilling and fracture technology. But we decided to try it. But it was not an easy deal. It took a long time. It took a lot of wells, like 17 or 18 initial wells to get commerciality. But then once it was established, it's tremendous. And so nobody thought you could get oil and gas out of the shales. It wasn't going to happen. But once we broke the code, as we call it, once we broke the code, then it became a tremendous oil field. So it's one of the bigger fields in the United States.
Now, was that about the time that you took the company public?
It was. First of all, we're talking 9 million acres. It's a big field, 1,500 square miles. And I'm a little guy. Nobody else believed in it. We couldn't do it on our own. And so we decided we've got to have the capital. And so we took the company public and, raised money. Like I say, nobody believed in it to begin with. Our stock went out $14 a share. We priced at the bottom of the range. We thought it might go 17, but no, it priced 14. We had a couple really great explorationists that had drilled wells out there and had reported their results while we were on the road doing a road show, Steve. They reported that this is just not going to work. That didn't help us any, as you can imagine. And prices bombed the range, but anyway, that $14, 2 years later, when the results came in about what we could do with it, 2 or 3 years later, soared up to $80. So we made a lot of people a lot of money, and that's continued, for an awfully long time with everything we do with, oil is wealth, and oil and gas is definitely wealth that really goes to the economy.
Yeah, that's very true, and it came really at exactly the right time. I'm amused, of course, that you could remember the pricing range, having worked for many years in finance and seen entrepreneurs saying, "Pricing is at the bottom of the range? Are you guys mad?"
It was bad.
Yeah. But it did come up at the right time because 2007, I think you said, and we have the financial crisis coming in 2008. And what was interesting, amid all the sort of the bad news we were getting in the economy or from Wall Street, there was a sort of local miracle in North Dakota. And if I had been more efficient, I would have I did not look, Amity looked at the St. Louis Fed's North Dakota unemployment figures. There's a change.
Well, it changed a whole lot up there. It drove unemployment to nothing. They reported 2%. But if there was somebody out there looking for a job, we couldn't find them. We put everybody to work, and it was a tremendous thing. People came from everywhere to go work, and they immediately was hard. And, so unemployment went to nothing. The GDP of North Dakota went straight up. They've, have their own legacy fund today in the state. Some $11 billion that they can choose to do something with someday.
And of course, and it wasn't only North Dakota, a sort of very chilly Saudi Arabia. There were all those stories about people living in sort of double wides and all the rest of it just to get there. And to give one number, and remember this is, the 2010s were not a glorious time economically, but cheaper energy saved Americans $1 trillion between 2008 and 2018. I mean, that's not small change. I mean, so at a time when there was depressed economic confidence, investment rates were historically low despite very low interest rates, which was interesting. Here we have a sector which is going hell for leather. And It also, though, gave, so it's good for the economy, but it also gave America energy independence, which is something that you have rightly and repeatedly stressed. I am old enough to remember the oil shocks and the various unhappiness accompanying that. So obviously one doesn't want oil shocks, but how important what do you see as the significance of the long-term significance of American energy independence and maintaining it?
Yeah, it's energy independence was something that, I started predicting in 2008. And of course, nobody thought that's possible, but we believed it was, and with where we could take horizontal drilling and what could be brought into production in the U.S. And certainly it happened. We soared upward from that 4.5 million barrels a day. Today we're producing about 13.6 million barrels a day. Still increasing a little bit, but we're getting to the top of the range at these prices. And we'll talk price here just a little bit, because price is important. And think about how cheap energy is when you look at it. Somebody gave me a number there at the table a minute ago about how cheap that is. And if you put it in real numbers, it is very cheap today. But for instance, and when we went public in 2007, a F-150, everybody knows what those are, would cost you $24,000. And today, I'll go ahead and give you another number here, and the average price of oil at that time was $64.56. Our price of oil today is about $57. So relative wise, we're 15 years later, okay? Today, that F-150 will cost you double that, $48,000 at least, and we're at $57 oil. So you can imagine, relative wise, where prices are. So it's very, very cheap. So sure enough, we've lowered the cost for all Americans, everybody in the world, for energy. So that's been done. So going forward, I think we'll have to be careful not to have a price shock, because eventually you get to the point you can't produce enough at a price. And so we're seeing rigs laid down, and this is the first year in 30 years that I've not had a rig run in North Dakota. None. It's not economic. So you park them. You lay people off. So that's business. That's what you do. So what does that set up? If things don't change, you'll have a price shock out there a few years now. You'll run out.
So what would you do? I'm just jumping ahead here. This is a question from Cyrus Ariani from Texas. What work needs, and we'll be talking about the government as well a bit later on, what work needs to be done to maintain this energy independence going forward?
The work that needs to be done going forward?
Yeah. The country,
There's a lot that has been done. Let's look at where we're at today with where we're at in the grand scheme of things with regulations. There's been a lot of rollback of regulations. Been opening up federal lands again with permitting. Before it was kind of a joke. You could file some permits as many as they allow you to, but then whether it granted or not was another story. Now you can get those permits on federal lands, and a lot of America is federal lands, particularly the lands that nobody wanted to locate on, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and some places that nobody wanted to build on, nobody wanted to homestead, nobody wanted to locate on. But today you can get permits and drill again. So that's been done. That's good. And some of the regulatory hurdles that was there before, they've been removed. So things are better, and that does lower our cost of doing business. We can do better out there. Don't get me wrong. To a point, and then you can't. So it takes price again, and so you have to have that. But I think that we need to make sure. I say we Americans need to make sure we're looking far enough ahead that we maintain energy independence. You don't ever want to be, on the short side of that. We've been there, we've done that, and you're always at somebody else's bidding. So you never want to be there. So we want to make sure we've got proper regulatory regime, and that allows us to go forward in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be, we live in a rough world, and the Europeans saw the consequence of cheap Russian gas. Didn't work out too well.
That's right, cheap Russian and cheap Middle East oil. There's been a lot of instances of it.
One of the things I suppose we're talking about taking decisions to drill or not. And this slightly anticipates what I'm going to ask you a little bit later about regulation. But to what extent do you think regulators actually understand, or are willing to understand, perhaps more importantly, the concept that if you're asking companies to invest in billions of dollars in the energy sector, in new wells and so on, infrastructure, they're going to want a return, which they may not want really to do if they think in 10 years' time they're going to be subject to windfall taxes or worse. Do they get that?
Yes, I think people understand that more now than ever before. So yes, I think that they do have a good understanding of that. Sometimes you have to remind them, that people, the investors do have to have a return, or they won't invest. And so I think the understanding is there, but make sure that, along the way we've done some things that, we had to lift the ban on exports. That was very, very important, but without that we could not have a viable industry here. We had to go from, this mindset, of running out or not having enough, to an era of abundance. We had to change the mindset in America to do that, to make sure, because you can't hoard material in a general economy. It doesn't work. So you got to go from that mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance, and be optimistic about the future at the same time. So I like to be optimistic, and that's what geologists do.
That's very true. Very true. But of course, you're a supporter of the free markets, a big supporter of the free markets. They helped you. They helped the industry raising capital. But you did, of course, have to deal with the problem that there was a conscious attempt to squeeze the oil industry of capital with the ESG regulations and that sort of thing. And they saw, and were pretty explicit about it on occasion, we're going to starve the oil and gas industry of cash.
Yes, there's been a lot of regulation, to basically starve the industry. It's like LNG, not allowing LNG facilities to be built. I mean, you think about that. This enabled America with what happened with the gas from Russia. This enabled America to furnish natural gas to all of our allies, to keep Europe from basically freezing, going cold, and was able to do that. But prior to some changes, I mean, we'd like to never got it off the ground that you could build LNG facilities. Well, what's mysterious about that? I mean, these things not going to blow up. They're not. You've never heard of an incident occur with them. I mean, we should have been doing that, without even thinking about it. So we finally get enough LNG facilities that we can furnish our allies with what they need today.
And those allies weren't always very far-sighted. I mean, the Germans and the LNG, for example, when the squeeze started happening, how many incoming LNG terminals did Germany have? 0. People who did, interestingly, were the Lithuanians. I can't think why they would not trust the Russians, but they built a floating terminal, or they bought a floating terminal, which they subtly called Independence, and so they were the first to realize, we need it.
Yes, exactly. So you had a lot of nearsightedness going on over there, and some of it, had to do with, they thought that they could leapfrog across the fossil fuel use to a green environment that you wouldn't need oil and gas, and so they went that direction. Well, that didn't work, and so once the gas was cut off, they didn't know what to do, and so it became desperate.
And some of them not desperate enough, actually. They carried on protesting. Which sort of comes to something that you talk about sort of generally, but I think it applies very much to this debate. A sort of debate is conducted at an emotional level and at an intellectual level, or a rational level. You call it intelligent level. And when I read what you were saying about that, it brought me back to a TV debate, which I watched in Britain in the very late 70s. The whole place was going under. It was before Mrs. T. And there was a debate between a very sort of learned chap and explaining why the system was no longer sustainable as is. And he was debating one of the top 2 or 3 trade union leaders in the country, later revealed to be on the take from the Russians, but never mind. And so this chap, not the traitor, but the pro-Thatcher person, made an elegant, perfectly reasoned dissection as to why Britain could not go on as it was. And the union leader, who was called Jack Jones, stood up and said, "Well, that's all very well, William, but you're talking about old people freezing." And he won the debate. And when I read your comments about how this debate rages, that I really did think of that story. That you're having to deal with the irrational as well as the rational is one thing, but having to deal with the irrational. And the irrational can take, I suppose, 2 shapes. One is just hysterical fears, but the other is misplaced faith. Would you like to comment on the energy transition? How's it going?
I would, because I think that was a lot of that misplaced faith. They didn't believe, and I think that's what keeps me going. Is you just have to have a what I call it internal faith. That one, I like change. I have a saying there that I put on the wall once in a while in my office. If you don't like change, you're going to love being totally out of it. Totally irrelevant, because that's what you become. So I think we have to have an in-bed faith going forward, knowing that we can get it done. And technology, we have a lot of technology that's come about with great inventions today on fuel cells and a lot of other things. utilizing natural gas, utilizing our natural resources. That's going to make a big difference in the world going forward. So, yeah, you have to have an internal faith.
Yeah. And just to go back to the capital markets just for a second, you then took Continental private. Would you like to talk about why?
Yes, it was real easy. At the time, we need the capital is great, and we made a lot of people a lot of money as a result of that. We didn't sell a lot of our stock. We sold about 15% at the time, and so it wasn't a big deal. But it got to be, when I took the company public, there's paying you to be a public company. You got an 8 to 9 times multiple at that time, multiple of earnings. And after COVID came, and energy prices went negative for a while. You went through a bad stretch there. Things looked terrible, but then it recovered slowly. But then after that, our market never recovered for energy. Still hadn't really. And so all of a sudden, we and everybody else in our sector was trading at 3 to 4 times multiple. Well, if you buy a hamburger stand, you'd pay 5 times earnings. So, it was not worth it to go through all the headache of quarterly reporting and everything you do, for that type of return. And so, we decided it'd be better off for us and all of our investors if we caught a high point, stock was high as it could get, and take it out. And that's what we did. Now, as a businessman, you wouldn't do that, right? You'd pick a low point, right? And why didn't I take it out when COVID was there at 7? Because it wasn't the right thing to do. So we took it out at 74. Okay? Because it was the right thing to do. And also, a lot of our people internally, we had about 16% we bought back from the public. 9% of that was our own people. That's internally that owned that interest in the company. So I want to make sure that they were paid.
But speaking frankly, you're a pretty independent guy. You can see that when you read your story. Again and again, it crops up. Do you like being captain of the ship, sort of without anyone peering too much over your shoulder?
Well, it's hard to hide.
So here's a question from Neil Karami from, Swanee, Georgia? What was Tennessee? But I may be misreading that, so very, very sorry, Neil. What do you see as being the biggest constraint on U.S. production, energy production? Presumably.
Well, today, no doubt, it's price. That's the biggest constraint, and so that'll come back. Might be a year or two or whatever. You have to have faith that it will, and that'll come back. So that right now, that's the biggest constraint that we have. But it's our production in the U.S. has to compete with everything in the world, and that's what we're seeing today. That's why myself, as an explorer, we took a recent position in Argentina, and I think everybody read about that. We're doing a lot of work in Turkey that we've been public with. So look around the world. It's all relative, but we have a lot of good stuff here in America yet. A lot of great fields. Our Bakken is one of those. Just because I don't have a rig running doesn't mean that it's over in the Bakken, because it's not. A lot of great reserves here yet. The Permian, one of the biggest oil fields in the world. So a lot of good things to do yet. As an explorer, you have to keep exploring and thinking that there's more out there, and certainly, but you have to have the belief to being explorationists that you're going to get recovery on your investment, regardless of where you're at, Argentina or anywhere else. And if you can't, you're not going to go there. And so we have to keep that level playing field here in America. Capitalism is very, very important.
Exactly, and I mean, this sort of follows on a little bit from that. You're talking about looking for places elsewhere. I mean, do you think, in terms of oil, my guess is no, because I think you see, in a way, you see supposed peaks as evidence of insufficient thinking, of opportunity, and you seem to be a great believer in potential. I hear the word, when I read your stuff, the word potential is always there. Are we near peak American shale oil?
Well, there've been a lot of peaks in production.
Yeah.
Okay, or people talk about them. Hubble's bell curve, and was talked about way back in the '80s, and where production peak and never come back. And then, gosh, we found out horizontal drilling could change all that. So will the shales peak? I think you harvest them, and pretty soon you start running short again. You find something else. So there again, you have to have faith that you can do that, and then you never give up the will to look. So that's a big deal. So I don't see it peaking. I think you get into an area of maturity, and fields become mature toward the end of their lives. So you have to recognize that and go on to something else. But there's a lot more production out there. It's amazing what some of the deeper pays are doing. Used to, we thought, natural gas, if you could get a well that'd make 1 million cubic feet a day, that's great. Today, there's wells, I'd call them super wells, perhaps. They're real deep, cost $25 million, but it makes 70, 80 million a day.
It's fantastic.
So, who would have thought it, right?
I'll ask one last question as we have to wrap this up. And Amity is making throat-cutting signs, we've got a lot of young people here, all beneficiaries from the wonderful Coolidge programs, and you've done tremendously well. You are this extraordinary American success story. What is your single piece of advice to the next generation of leaders?
Never give up. Never give up. Yeah. We at Continental believe in the culture of the possible, and the impossible just takes, and more difficult just takes a little bit longer. Okay, don't ever give up. So it's pretty easy. So.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely wonderful.
You bet.